Hey, what's going on, guys? Rome Gaming here. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention some of my socials in the description of the video. If you want to support the channel, please check those out. If you want to support the channel in other ways, please consider just dropping a like or a nice comment somewhere on the video. It really helps the algorithm push our content out there to a broader audience. With that being said, hope you guys enjoy the episode. Hey, what's going on, guys? Rome Gaming here, back in another video. Today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at Holy Paladin for Season 1 in War Within. This guide is specifically just going to cover Mythic Plus. I'm not a raider or a PvP or anything like that, but if you do raid or PvP, you might still watch this guide and get a little bit of value out of it. But for the most part, we're going to be focusing around Mythic Plus. All right, let's quickly talk about some of the main changes going into War Within from Dragonflight. So first main change is Glimmer of Light was removed from the game. So that was a heal over time effect. And this heal over time effect came from our Holy Shock. And whenever we healed targets through our Holy Shock ability, all the targets that had Glimmer of Light on them would be healed. Now, this is very important because Glimmer of Light was one of the core ways we really played around Holy Paladin. We tried to spread out all those Glimmer of Lights, and if we needed to quickly apply Glimmer of Lights, we could do that through our Daybreak cooldown. Now, Daybreak was also removed from the game, so now that whole sort of Daybreak, Divine Toll, Glimmer of Light sort of combo that we were doing is now completely gone from the game, and Holy Paladin plays a little bit differently now. So most of our throughput now actually comes from our Holy Shock and our Eternal Flames. So a lot of our power has now been put into our spenders. And this is really good because this is something that, you know, the community really wanted. We didn't really want to feel like a Restoration Druid. We wanted that high burst healing, which is very iconic to Holy Paladin. That's kind of how we've played in previous expansions, and we had kind of deviated away from that. So our Holy Shock has been buffed, our Word of Glory has been buffed, and we also don't play around Infusion of Light as much. So if you're not familiar with what Infusion of Light is, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but this is no longer quite as important as it has been in the past, as most of our healing is now in our spenders. So I kind of like to think of Infusion of Light more as a filler more than anything else, and you'll be combining your Infusion of Light typically with your Holy Light. Then one final thing I did want to talk about is we do have Light of the Martyr. So this was actually changed. This was a casted spell, and you kind of cast it to do an amount of healing to sacrifice a portion of your health while on the move, and this has been changed to actually beef up our Holy Shock. So the way this works is when we Holy Shock on a target and we're above 70% health, Holy Shock's healing is increased by 35%, but we get an Absorb Shield on ourselves for 30% of the amount healed. That prevents Beacon of Light from healing you until this Absorb Shield has been healed through. So this is very strong, but this gets even stronger through our Bestow Light talent here. So Light of the Martyr's health threshold is reduced by 70% and increases the Holy Shock's healing by an additional 5% for 5 seconds. Light of the Martyr is active, stacking up to 3 times, so we get more Holy Shock healing through this talent. And then we also get some passive healing from this once we are below that 70% health threshold. Okay, let's quickly talk about hero talents now. So we have 2 trees. We got Herald of the Sun and Lightsmith. So let's talk about Lightsmith first. So Lightsmith is going to be a little bit more focused around damage and sort of tank burst healing. And Herald of the Sun is going to be more focused on just raw throughput and group healing. So we are not going to be running a Lightsmith. I mean, you can run Lightsmith. There is a Mythic Plus build for it. However, I think that most people are going to be running Herald of the Sun. Lightsmith just has a lot of talent nodes that are very weak in comparison to Herald of the Sun. And it has a big emphasis on tank healing as well. And tank healing is very important, but in terms of the damage profile in Mythic Plus dungeons, right now we're seeing a bunch of group burst damage. So overall, I think you're going to see more value from Herald of the Sun. So I have some videos already kind of diving into both of these trees on my channel if you want to check those out. So I'm not going to do a deep dive into either of these. Really, I'm just going to focus on Herald of the Sun and just some of the core aspects of it. So the way Dawnlight will work is it's going to kind of revolve around our Holy Prism or Barrier of Faith, depending on which talent you take. And after you cast one of those abilities, your next 2 Holy Power spending abilities will apply Dawnlight onto your target, radiating damage or healing over 8 seconds. Then 8% of that damage and healing radiates to nearby allies or enemies, reduced beyond 5 targets. So In itself, Dawnlight isn't insanely strong. What makes Dawnlight strong is going to be down here at the bottom, Sun's avatar. So during our Avenging Wrath, we become linked to our Dawnlights, and basically like a beam of light goes out and your allies or enemies can pass through those beams of light, and it does a whole bunch of damage or healing. Now, this is also a little bit easier to play around due to the second paragraph here. Activating Avenging Wrath will apply those 4 Dawnlights onto nearby allies or enemies, so we don't have to worry about, who we're applying Dawnlight to. It's just automatically going to apply for us when we pop our wings. So just to kind of show you guys what this looks like, we can go to a target here, we can pop our wings, and you can see here that I have these sort of beams coming out, and allies and enemies that pass through that are going to be damaged or healed. So this is a very powerful ability. All right, now let's just talk about a few core talents here on the tree itself. So Eternal Flame here in the middle, this replaces our Word of Glory, and it puts a heal over time effect on a specific target. And the healing is actually increased by 25% when cast on ourselves. So the heal over time effect from this is not super strong. So really, this isn't like a playstyle where we're having to manage the heal over time effect on 5 different targets. Use it the same way you would use Word of Glory. The main value that we get from this talent is obviously just going to be the burst healing that we get from this. Now, however, we can cheese Light of the Martyr a little bit with this, with that heal over time effect, because not only are we getting a hot on ourselves, we're also getting it beefed up by 25%. So if we need to get that absorb shield off of ourselves, typically you can keep an Eternal Flame on yourself and it will kind of handle a lot of that absorb shield. Then down here in the middle, we have Blessing of Anshe here, and basically our heal over time effects have a chance to make our next Holy Shock deal 200% more damage or healing. Now, this is actually a proc that you can track. I do have a weak aura that we can utilize to kind of help us track this better, but if you don't want to mess with a weak aura, basically what will happen is your Holy Shock here will kind of glow, and when that glows, that means that Blessing of Anshe has procced. So very important to keep track of that, because when it does proc, you want to make sure that you are healing the lowest health target with that beefed up Holy Shock to minimize your overhealing. Then outside of that, not too many changes in terms of your gameplay, just kind of general buffs to like our Holy Shock and our Dawnlight. Okay, now let's talk about secondary stats. So secondary stats, we're going to be focused on mainly haste and critical strike. This is a beta character, so that's why you're seeing such like crazy values here, but on retail, I'll be focusing mainly on haste, and this is season 1 of War Within, so we're going to have really low haste values, probably looking like 20-25%, and then critical strike is going to be your next priority. And haste is going to be very important to us because Holy Paladin is a very high APM spec, and we really rely on getting through our globals as quickly as we possibly can and just kind of mashing spells. So the spec doesn't feel super great, to be honest, until you're getting like 25-30%. It does feel a little bit sluggish, but once you do get your haste value up, Holy Paladin does feel a lot better to play. So haste is going to be your main priority. After that, we're going into critical strike, and critical strike is going to be very important, mainly due to infusion of light. So greater judgment prevents an additional 100% damage dealt by the target. So the more that we're critical striking with our judgment, the more damage that we are preventing with it. And then critical strike is also going to be very strong due to veneration here. So if we look at the second part, Flash of Light, Holy Light, and Judgment critical strikes reset the cooldown of Hammer of Wrath and make it usable on any target regardless of their health. So the more critical strikes that we're getting, the more chances that we get to reset Hammer of Wrath, thus more burst healing that we get. And then final reason here for critical strike is due to Awestruck. So Holy Shock, Holy Light, and Flash of Light critical healing is increased by 20%. So the more that we are critical striking, the more that we can proc Awestruck, the more healing throughput. Then after that, we're going to be focusing on Mastery Lightbringer, so it increases the healing done up to X amount based on the proximity of your target. The closer you are to your target, the more healing you do, and you get max mastery on yourself. And then our fourth priority is going to be Versatility. So increases our damage done and reduces our damage taken. All right, now let's talk about some of our core talent spells and rotation, and just kind of the general flow and how you kind of play Holy Paladin. So Holy Paladin really can be baked into 4 spells here. And the reason it only looks like 4 spells is due to a macro that I have. We'll kind of cover this a little bit more in the macro section. This is kind of what it looks like, and it's just going to combine my Judgment, Crusader Strike, and Consecration into one button. We will cover that more a little bit later in the video, but just know that they're all in my 2 key right now. And the whole idea of Holy Paladin is to build up your holy charges. So you can see here as I cast spells, I'm building up holy charges, and then I can spend them on my holy power spenders, such as Eternal Flame or Word of Glory. So normally, historically, your spenders are more powerful than your builders, but right now in Holy Paladin, I would argue that your spender Holy Shock is going to be your main healing ability. So I wouldn't really focus on using Holy Shock too much on damage. I'd focus on using it on healing. So a lot of your healing rotation is going to kind of look like this. We're spending Holy Shock on ourselves, and then we're spending it on Eternal Flame here, and that's doing a burst healing. It's putting a heal every time effect on ourselves, and we can kind of continue to Holy Shock ourselves and spend those charges on Eternal Flame. Now you can kind of see there, I ran out of Holy Shock charges, so now I would need to rely on my damage macro here to kind of build up holy power a little bit faster. So the whole idea of this macro is to kind of rotate through our Judgment, through our Crusader Strike, and through our Consecration, and it will just kind of loop through there, and it will build up holy power for it. So let's quickly just talk about this macro, what it even is. So it will loop through our Judgment, and Judgment is very important for us because this will generate holy power that we can then spend on Eternal Flame here. So it will go through Judgment, it will go through Crusader Strike, which also generates holy power for us. It also reduces the cooldown of Holy Shock by 2 seconds. So if you remember, Holy Shock is our most powerful healing ability. So to get CDR on that is very, very strong. And then the third part of this is going to be Consecration. And if you've never seen Consecration before, you just drop it on the ground. Enemies standing in it will take damage. Now, Consecration is very important to us due to, in our Paladin tree, we have Strength of Conviction here. So while we're standing within that Consecration, our Word of Glory, which is the same thing again as our Eternal Flame, it just changed here in our hero tree, that gets beefed up by 10% while we're standing within our Consecration. So to kind of go through this again, just to break this down, we're using Holy Shock to heal people. We're spending our holy power charges on Eternal Flame, and then we're just going through our damage rotation to build even more holy power. So that right there is the very, very core of Holy Paladin. So until you kind of get that down, I would not move on to any other part of this guide. I would get that portion down, because if you're not efficiently and effectively building holy power, you cannot heal on this spec. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is, let's just go ahead and get into Infusion of Light. So it's actually a passive here. Type it out really quick, Infusion of Light. And I believe we talked about this earlier as well, but your critical holy shocks empower your next spell cast. And it has 3 different spells here. So if it's Flash of Light, the mana cost is reduced by 30%. Not needed too much, to be honest. We really don't have a ton of mana issues playing Holy Paladin. We have Holy Light. The healing is increased by 100%. This is what I'd recommend to use your Infusion of Light charges on. You get more healing throughput with it. And then you can also use it on Judgment as well, kind of passively. Especially if you have allies, like if everybody's topped off, you can just spend Infusion of Light charges on your Judgment, and this will prevent the damage dealt by the target by 100% of the damage done. All right, now the big question is going to be, how do we even track this? So if you go back to the first sentence, your critical holy shock. So whenever a holy shock critical strikes, we have a chance to get this Infusion of Light proc. So let's just kind of go through our rotation until we get something to crit here. So this is it. It's these little sort of yellow bars here on the side. And we can see in the top left, we have an Infusion of Light proc. So I would recommend to use this proc on our Holy Light. So I kind of built it up again here. Here's the bars back. So I recommend to use this on Holy Light in the middle. Healing is increased by 100% on your Holy Light. So just cast it. And now our Holy Light consumed that charge, and its healing was increased by 100%. And again, the reason I recommend to use this on Holy Light is mainly due to throughput. Judgment isn't going to give you that much throughput really. And then Flash of Light, you know, the mana cost isn't normally a super major issue for us. All right, so we talked about that. Let's now talk about Light of the Martyr, which we did talk about earlier. So our Holy Shock is going to be increased by 35% while we are above 70% health, but we have this sort of mini game of this Absorb Shield that we got to kind of play with. So we can kind of see here as I start to heal people, you can kind of see, I don't know if you guys can kind of see it, but there is a little absorb shield now that I have to kind of heal through. And this absorb shield will actually grow the more that I use Holy Shock over and over, and it will continue to grow until I get rid of it. So this is not on any sort of timer. This isn't going to go away. You do have to manage this, and you do have to address this at some point. So when it's really low like this, you can just kind of set it and forget it. But as this becomes bigger and it gets like 25-30% of your health bar, this is something you do eventually, need to address. And the way you address it is by single target healing yourself. So you can see right there, I just cast 2 Holy Shocks on myself and the absorb shield started to go away. So one thing you can do again to kind of cheese this is use Eternal Flame on yourself. So I can Holy Shock my allies over here, and then I can Eternal Flame myself. Huh? Oh. So one thing that you can kind of do to cheese this is use Eternal Flame on yourself. And the reason for this is because the healing is increased by 25% on yourself, and you also get the heal over time effect. So that heal over time effect can kind of help negate the absorb shield a little bit. So as I continue to heal this guy, I could just Eternal Flame myself, and there goes the absorb shield, and I don't have to worry about it for the most part while Eternal Flame is on myself. All right, and the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of the core sort of rotation is going to be Shield of the Righteous. So this is kind of coming into play now. So this costs 3 holy power, and this is going to be one of your main damaging abilities. Now, by itself, Shield of Righteous isn't that strong, to be honest. I wish I would kind of rework this a little bit, maybe beef the damage from it somehow. But we do have a couple talents that do synergize with it, and we've already talked about one of them, but Shining Righteousness here, we haven't talked about this one yet. So this will increase the damage of the first target struck with Shield of Righteous by 75,000. So this is pretty nice because this does help it in like single target scenarios. And then the second portion of this, every five shields make your next Word of Glory or Light of Dawn costs no holy power. So this is actually a stacking buff. You can see up here in the top right, Shining Righteousness. You see I got 2 stacks on it. It only lasts for 30 seconds. So if you're not constantly kind of getting those shields of righteous in, you will lose this buff. To be honest, it's not super powerful. This isn't something that I really play around a whole bunch, but it is kind of a nice to have. And that's something that you do kind of need to be aware of so you can utilize it. And then over here on the left, we have Strength of Conviction. Going back to our Consecration, when you're within it, our Shield of Righteous is going to be beefed up by 10%. All right, that kind of brings us into cooldowns. So the first one I want to talk about is going to be one of your main ones here, Beacon of Virtue. So this is going to be a very important spell for us, and it's actually going to be very mana hungry. It costs 100,000 mana. It's on a 15-second cooldown, so this is something that you might have to kind of be very wary of, and you only really want to be using it when you need it. This isn't something you're going to be casting on cooldown, really. So what it'll do is it'll put a beacon of light out on all your allies, and any healing that you do will then be dispersed out onto all those allies. So this is going to be probably your main group heal button. And what I like to do is I like to typically pair this with a cooldown. So something like Holy Prism, for example. Now, of course, you don't always have to do that, but just know that option is there. If your party is at critical health, you can always pair a major cooldown with your Beacon of Virtue and really push up those health bars. All right, next major cooldown I want to talk about is Blessing of Summer. So it's on a 45-second cooldown, and this will actually rotate between all the different seasons. That'll give us summer, autumn, winter, and spring, and they all have their sort of unique benefits to them. And really, it's like 4 buttons in one, but thankfully, it only takes up 1 button on our action bar, so that's really nice. It'll automatically rotate through each season for us. So it starts out with summer here, 45-second cooldown. Blesses an ally for 30 seconds, causing 12% of all healing to be converted into damage onto nearby enemies, and 12% of all damage should be converted into healing onto an injured ally within 40 yards. Typically, you want to be putting this on somebody else besides yourself, especially somebody who does a lot of damage like your big pumper DPS, or somebody who's going to take a lot of healing, such as your tank. You as a healer typically don't do either of those. You don't do a lot of damage, and you're typically not taking near as much damage as the tank is. so it's normally not super efficient to put on yourself. Then after Summer is used, you can see on my bars here, it's on cooldown. The next one up is Blessing of Autumn. Bless an ally for 30 seconds, causing cooldowns to recover 30% faster. You can use this one on yourself, typically because, you know, it just depends on what's coming up. If you have a tough healing encounter coming up, you need your cooldowns back, you definitely want to be using this on yourself to make sure your group's not wiping. However, typically, this is going to be another one of those blessings that you're using on an ally. And by ally, this one's probably going to be used more specifically on a DPS rather than a tank. Up next here, we have Blessing of Winter. So this is going to be the one that you use on yourself. 45-second cooldown, bless a friendly healer for 30 seconds, restoring 1% mana every 2 seconds. So a really good way for us to be able to restore our mana. And a lot of our mana management kind of comes through rotating through your blessings efficiently. And then the last one here is Blessing of Spring. So bless an ally for 30 seconds, increasing their healing done by 15% and healing received by 30%. So Blessing of Spring is probably going to be another one that you're putting on yourself as well. You could also throw this up on the tank if they are taking very spiky damage, but for the most part, I just pop Blessing of Spring on myself. All right, the next major cooldown we're going to talk about here is Holy Prism. On a 30-second cooldown, and basically all this is going to do is fire a beam of light that kind of scatters into a clump of targets. You can cast this on allies or enemies. So if you need more healing, you're going to be casting on allies. If you need more damage, you're going to be casting it on enemies. And this is going to be a pretty strong talent specifically due to a Dawnlight. So when we do cast our Holy Prism, our next 2 Holy Power spinning abilities will be applying this Dawnlight. And that Dawnlight's going to pulse out a bunch of AoE healing for us. So a really good talent, and you want to be using Holy Prism as much as you possibly can on cooldown. Very short cooldown, so very easy to play around. Then we also have Aurora here. So after you cast Holy Prism or Barrier of Faith, you gain Divine Purpose, which is going to make our next Holy Power ability free and increase its damage and healing by 15%. And then finally, we have Divine Favor here as a passive. After casting Holy Prism, the healing of your next Holy Light or Flash of Lights increased by 40%. Cast time reduced by 30% and mana cost reduced by 50%. So you always want to be using Divine Favor with your Holy Light. So Divine Favor is baked in to Holy Prism as well as our Dawnlight outside of using Sun's Avatar with Avenging Wrath. So a very strong button, and you know, it's just something that you want to constantly be pressing. Most things kind of take care of themselves, but you can kind of coordinate this with your Divine Favor for those beefed up Holy Lights. Then up next, we have Divine Toll, which is probably one of the most fun buttons in the game to press on a 45-second cooldown. And this is instantly going to cast Holy Shock on up to 5 targets. Now, unfortunately, this does not work with our Blessing of Anshe, unfortunately, because that would be insanely busted, but it still does cast that Holy Shock on up to 5 targets, so it's still extremely strong. So you will use this in emergencies, and then you can also take down here Quicken Invocation for 15 reduced seconds on your cooldown. Now this will also synergize down here with Rising Sunlight. So after casting your Divine Toll, your next 2 Holy Shocks are going to cast 2 additional times. And then same thing with our Avenging Wrath, which we haven't really talked about yet, but after we cast Avenging Wrath, our next 2 Holy Shocks will cast 2 additional times. So one of your strongest cooldowns, let's go ahead and talk about probably your strongest cooldown, your Avenging Wrath. All right, Avenging Wrath is going to be over here on our Paladin tree on a 2-minute cooldown. Call upon the light, become an Avatar of Retribution, increasing your damage and healing done by 15% for 20 seconds, and allowing Hammer of Wrath to be cast on any target. So when we do pop this, I'll just do Avenging Wrath, and now we can use Hammer of Wrath, and then the health threshold no longer matters. Now, our Avenging Wrath did also proc our Sun's Avatar here. I don't know if you kind of saw the beams coming off of me, but it did proc Sun's Avatar, and we got all of those Dawn lights out. So not only is Avenging Wrath giving us that insane damage, that insane healing, it's also proccing our Dawn Light as well. And then it also allows us to become linked to our Dawn Lights. So an insanely strong button to press, a very fun button to press. And then we also have over here on the right, Avenging Wrath Might. So not only will it do everything we just discussed, this will also increase our critical strike chance by 15% for 20 seconds. And then we also have Rising Sunlight that we talked about just a second ago. So after casting Avenging Wrath, your next 2 Holy Shocks cast 2 additional times, and those are just going to be insanely beefed up Holy Shocks. And then the final thing I want to talk about here is Awakening. So as we spend our holy power spenders, we get this stack of Awakening. And at 15 stacks of Awakening, our next judgment is going to activate our Avenging Wrath for 12 seconds. So this is something that you do want to track. I do have a weak hour for this. We'll talk about it in the weak hour section. But once you get to 15 stacks, our wings pop as well. So you kind of want to rotate in between Awakening stacks and then the actual cooldown of your Avenging Wrath. And you kind of want to spread those out somewhat evenly to get the most uptime on your wings. You don't want to be overlapping your wings. Okay, up next we have Lay on Hands on a 7-minute cooldown. This will heal a friendly target for 100% of your maximum health. Now this cannot be used on targets with Forbearance. We'll talk about that here in a minute once we get into the utility section. But just know that this is a very strong single target heal. This will pretty much top up anybody besides a tank to full health. That's also worth noting Tyrion's Devotion here. This does kind of bake into our mana management. Lay on Hands cooldowns reduced by 1.5 seconds per holy power spent, and it restores 5% of our mana. So you really want to be using Lay on Hands a little bit more aggressively. You don't have to. It just kind of depends on how your mana is looking. But you know, if you're in a situation where you're kind of baking through your mana pretty quick, you might want to be a little bit more aggressive with your Lay on Hands to restore some of your mana. All right, now let's quickly talk about some of the utility that Holy Paladin brings to the group. Main thing is going to be our Devotion Aura. Let me bring that up really quick. So Devotion Aura here, party and raid members within 40 yards, bolstered by their devotion, reducing damage taken by 3%. Very strong. You always want to make sure that you have that up. Now this also pairs with our Mastery on a 3-minute cooldown, empowers your chosen aura for 8 seconds. This is going to increase our damage reduction to 12%. So a very strong button on a pretty forgiving cooldown. 3 minutes isn't terribly bad. And that is a very big damage reduction because it is a percentage. So the higher in keys you get, the more value you will see out of this button. Next defensive we're going to talk about is Divine Protection. 42-second cooldown, going to reduce all damage that we take by 20% for 8 seconds. Again, another very forgiving cooldown, 42 seconds, not too bad at all. You should be rotating this, you know, pretty freely. Just kind of bake it into your rotation. This should be one of those buttons that you're kind of pairing up with, you know, one of those. Let's just say, for example, one of those bolts of damage. Then we also have Divine Shield here on a 3.5-minute cooldown. This is going to basically make us immune to all damage for 8 seconds. And this will put something called Forbearance on us. So if you're not familiar with what Forbearance is, we have a few different spells that kind of overlap these Forbearance charges, and it kind of prevents us from using certain spells back to back, which could be very overpowered in many situations. So for example, let's just kind of segue into Blessing of Protection as well, because this also uses Forbearance. So very similar to your Divine Shield that we just talked about, Blessing of Protection is going to put another shield on another target. You can put it on yourself as well, but this will only reduce physical damage. So since this also causes Forbearance on the target, what this means is you can't Divine Shield yourself and then Blessing of Protection yourself back to back. So just to show you that, let's bring the two spells up right here. I will Divine Shield myself. You can see I got Forbearance up. So this is going to prevent me from using Divine Shield, Hand of Protection, or Lay on Hands on myself. So you can see Lay on Hands and Blessing of Protection, they're grayed out. All right, then we also have Blessings of Sacrifice here. So blesses a party or raid member, reducing the damage you take by 30%, but you suffer 100% of the damage prevented. So typically, you don't want to be putting this on the tank because the tank is taking a ton amount of damage that for the most part, they can self-heal through. So really, you're going to be putting this on a DPS target that might be standing in something they shouldn't be, and it's kind of like a last-ditch effort to kind of soften that blow a little bit, and you take some of that damage. So this is a very core part of Holy Paladin, is using your Blessing of Sacrifice. So something that you want to be using pretty freely. It's on a 2-minute cooldown as well. You could also pair this with like a large dot effect. Let's just say like Gut Shot, for example, in the Siege of Borealis dungeon. Puts a heavy dot on a target, so you can Blessing of Sacrifice and you can cut that dot in half with something like this. And I'm just going to kind of combine utility and defensives into one section. They're kind of the same thing. So we also have Blinding Light here. Let me pull that up. Blinding Light's going to be like our AoE stop on a 1.5-minute cooldown. You can use this to interrupt a bunch of casts. Very good ability. We also have Hammer of Justice on 1 minute cooldown to stun a target for 6 seconds. Another interrupt stop. We have our Rebuke as well on a 15-second cooldown, and this is going to be yet another stop that we have. So we have a decent amount of mob control on Holy Paladin. Then finally, we do have our Cleanse here. So cleanse a friendly target, removing all poison, disease, and magic effects. And we also have Divine Steed here on a 45-second recharge. Really nice because we get 2 charges of it, and this can really help us just kind of position ourselves a little bit better to move out of swirlies or whatever. Then another thing I almost missed here is our Intercession, 10-minute cooldown. This is going to be our Battle Res ability. If somebody does die in combat, you do have the ability to bring them back to life. Should really be coordinated with your group, because if you do mess this up, other specs that have Battle Res, you all share a cooldown together. So just be very careful using this. And then I think this is going to be the last thing I talk about in this section. Blessing of Freedom, 25-second cooldown. If you do have an ally or somebody who is slowed, you can Blessing of Freedom them. And basically, well, I put it on him by accident, but I meant to put it on myself. But it can remove them from that slow effect. So it can be really good for like a tank, somebody who's kind of in the thick of everything. Getting hit with a bunch of slows can be really good on like a melee DPS. So something that you should be using on a really low cooldown. So something that should be, again, kind of baked into your normal rotation. And there are certain bosses that you can use this on to kind of cheese some of their like magic effects. So for example, the final boss in Necrotic Wake, the freeze effect that they do, you can Blessing of Freedom a target and it will get them out of that freeze effect if your healer, for whatever reason, messed up their dispel. All right, now let's talk about macros. So this is my damage macro. And this is a way for me to kind of rotate through my spells to be able to generate holy power efficiently and effectively. Now, I'm not saying necessarily this is what you should do. I'm not saying this is the most efficient thing to do, but this is what I do. It really helps me play Holy Paladin. First spell is going to be Judgment. And the reason I do Judgment first is because that's on a little bit longer cooldown than Crusader Strike. So we want to kind of get that ticking first. And then with our Judgment, we also have, I'm not sure if I talked about this yet, but our Greater Judgment, which will reduce the damage that the target deals by 100,000. The next damaging ability that they do will be reduced by 100,000. And that also generates a holy power. And, you know, again, the whole purpose of this button is to be able to quickly and efficiently generate holy power. It doesn't do a whole bunch of healing or anything like that, but it does give us the holy power, which is then converted into healing. So to show you what this looks like, I'm just in here pressing 3. I have holy power now. I'll spend it, use a few holy shocks. Okay, back to spenders or generators. Excuse me. Okay, max holy power, throwing some holy shocks. And, you know, it's just kind of a rotation between these 3 or 4 buttons. Then when your Infusion of Light procs, then you can spend that on your Holy Light. Now, that's the only macro that I use for Holy Paladin. I do also want to mention mouse overs. So mouse overs are now built into the game. So if you're a player who has a whole bunch of mouse over macros, you can ditch those completely and just check this button here under mouse over cast. And now everything will be turned into a mouse over ability for both damage and healing. And if you're not familiar with what a mouse over is, it's a way to heal targets without having to select them. So the reason this is important because it's less button clicks, it's less cognitive overload, it's less things that you have to think about. So just to give you a quick example. So when I select myself, you can see I'm targeted over here. Let me unselect myself. And you can see I'm just going to hover over my name, press Holy Shock, and I healed myself. Same thing on this guy here. I'm going to hover over him, Holy Shock. Now I healed him. All right, now let's talk about weak auras. So I do have a weak aura to track Awakening here, which is pretty nice because Awakening is something that you kind of want to time. You don't have to, but typically you don't want to waste 15 stacks of Awakening before you go into a boss. So we do have a weak aura for this, and this is called Awakening Progress Bar. I'll put this in the description of the video. But what it does here, I'll just select it. You can kind of see I can kind of move it around here. Here's the 15 stacks. And as you spend holy power abilities, this will build up in stacks. And that way you can just kind of track your Awakening proc for your wings. So to quickly show you what that looks like, you can see here I built up a couple charges. I'm just kind of continue healing myself here. So I'm going to press Eternal Flame, spend holy power, and then I get another stack. So as you approach that 15 stacks, this is going to kind of help you plan when to use your Awakening. This can really help you in keys, especially if you have like certain packs that are very difficult. you don't necessarily have to use your wings on them. Instead, you can just use your awakening proc on that pack and then save your 2-minute wings cooldown. And our next week card we're going to talk about is going to kind of focus on Blessing of Anshe. So in Blessing of Anshe procs, our next holy power is going to be beefed by 200% with the damage and the healing. So this is something we want to kind of track because we don't want to overheal with it. And we want to make sure that we're healing the lowest health targets when this does proc. So actually when this does proc, your unit frames already track it. Your action bars track it. It puts a glow effect around your holy shock. But to me, that's not super obvious. So I have a weak card that kind of tracks this and puts it into like an icon over here. And just to kind of show you guys what this looks like, here it is over here on the right. It's glowing, and that means you can also see holy shock is glowing down here on the bottom. This means our next holy shock is going to be beefed by 200%. So that healed me for almost 1,000,000 health right there. So very important to be able to track that. And with this weak aura specifically, it had some weird icon with Hammer of Wrath. So if you want to remove that, all you have to do is come in here and delete whatever numbers here. Just completely delete that and then change this drop down to automatic and close it. And then that way it'll use the correct icon instead of Hammer of Wrath. And then the very last weak aura I'm going to talk about here is sort of a talent reminder weak aura. And if you are spec'd into one of these talents, such as Improved Cleanse or Turn Evil, and you don't need it for that dungeon, this weak aura will remind you when you enter the dungeon. It'll say, hey, you don't need Turn Evil, so go ahead and spec out of it. And it will also remind you if you do need Turn Evil or Improved Cleanse, it will remind you and say, hey, make sure you're taking this talent before you start the dungeon. All right, guys, super long video here. I'm pretty tired, so I'm just gonna end it here. I don't know, I probably missed a couple things, but I tried to cover absolutely everything I could. Let me know what you guys think about it. Let me know if you guys have any ideas in terms of like additional macros or weak auras that could be useful to other people. I will make sure to include those in future guides. So thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe if you found any value out of this video. And I also have some socials in the description of the video if you guys do want to check those out. Again, thank you guys for watching. We'll see you on the next one.